All right, so how would we modify this application where we are now checking for the age of the user, the input of the user, and I'm just going to add in here answer with y, and then the input of the user, and now we need to convert that into, or parse that into a string. So we're going to parse. I'll need to override it at 13. And actually, let's check if they are older than 18 first, because I'm above 8. So go in or not. So I'm going to do it like efficient ways. Let's say over yes or no. So add the semi in here answer, and then we can here, and I need to add the if statement here. I'm going to then, so if they make more sense, So here I'm going to say whether the person said console.readline, and then so answer with here, and then we will equal sign, and then so let's look at this. I'll set it to false, which we don't have to because by default it will be false either way, right? But just to make it clearer, we have it here. Then we're checking if they're at least 13 years old, if they are at least stored inside of other if state in the person code and party in the whatever things. But and that's I need to add the equal sign here. So let's say we are 18, go party in the one party inside of the kindergarten. So let's run this application. Welcome back. In this video, I want to show you a slightly different way of using if statements. So I have this int month now that I set to 5. Then I have this string month name. And then I have this if statement that has a bunch of else ifs and an else. So you see the difference between them is that here I'm using curly brackets to set my code up that will be executed once this statement is true. Okay. However, if I have a statement that is just one line of code, I don't need to use the curly brackets. So if it's 2 lines of code, then I need to actually use 2 lines of code. So here, for example, if I were to then say int or month equals 2, for example, then that is fine. But here I couldn't do that. So let's say I want to add another line here, month equal 3, like so. Then it will jump into the beginning of the line. So suddenly this code is incorrect. So this will not work because I don't have the curly brackets around it. However, if I only have one line, so this is just one line of code, then I can have it after the if statement directly. So here you see it's indented with a tab. So this is a tab wide, so to speak. And by doing so, this is valid code. But once you need multiple lines of code, then you need to use the curly brackets. However, by default, I would just recommend to always use curly brackets. Then you don't have that problem where you ever come into the situation where you're creating chaos or code that then can run into problems later on. So this here, however, does look nicer, right? If we look at it, it just does look so much cleaner if you look at this code instead of having a bunch of curly brackets. Now, there are people who set the curly brackets at the top here. So for example, like this, and that is fine as well. That works. But by default, Visual Studio just puts it into a separate line. So then you know exactly which code is part of the code that will be executed once this if statement is true. Okay, and once we get to the line 7 in our runtime. Okay, so that's just a little something that I wanted to show you. See you in the next video. Welcome back. In this video, I want to show you a switch statement and how it works. And in the next video, we're going to look at the difference between the two. So when to use which of the two variants, because the switch statement is very similar to the if statement. So we've seen how the if statement works, including else if and else. Now let's look at how the switch statement works, and it uses keywords such as switch, case, break, and default. Okay, so let's use all of those 4 words by starting with a switch statement. So you see there's this snippet, this code snippet. So if you enter switch and press tab, then it gives you a default switch here. So obviously you need to replace the variables that you are looking on. So basically a switch is like a light switch that you can turn on or off, right? But the light switch only has 2 cases, but there are situations where you might have multiple cases. So there's a switch which can go, like for example, when you're driving in the car, you have a switch which goes from driving to park, or from parking to, I think, reverse to neutral to driving, and then to speed or sport. I think sport it is, at least in my car. So there you have basically also a switch which has 5 different cases. Okay, so here we're looking at switch, and what we're checking for is our integer month. Okay, so int month. And this is an example where we are actually using an int, but you can also use strings or other data types in here, but usually it's used with ints and very easily so. And then you have the different cases. So for example, case 1. So in case month, this integer here is 1. Then we want for our month name to be January. Okay, very simple example. But then we need to add this break keyword. Why do we need this break keyword? What break does is it makes sure that after this statement is true, none of the below can be true. It's similar to what we saw with if statements, right? So if this if statement is true, then none of this code will be executed. However, if this if statement is not true, then this one will be checked. And if this one is true, none of the below will be executed. So basically we're saying break out of this if statement, get out of it, and then keep going with the code below that. So once this break is executed, the code goes on at line 29 in this case. Okay, so now let's have the other cases. So for example, we have case 2 where the month is February, and then we have case 3 where the month is March. And then we have this default case, which basically sets our month name to unknown, for example. So what default does is, default is basically this else block, which takes care of all the other options. So if month is anything but the numbers that we have covered, we're going to jump into the default case. And then we're just going to set the month name to unknown. And that's generally speaking how a switch case or a switch statement looks like. So you have the switch keyword, then you have your brackets in which you put in the variable that you want to compare to, and then you compare the variable to the cases. So you compare month to the value of month to the case of the value being 1. If that's the case, run this code and then break out of it. If that's not true, then go to case 2. And if that's again not true, go to case 3. If that's again not true, go to case default. Now, obviously, you can also have case 4, 5, 6, and so forth. You could go all the way to basically have all of the months. All right. So this is how a switch case looks like in comparison to an if and else if. All right. And now we could go ahead and print out the name, the month is, and then we use month name here, month name, like so. And we need to add the $sign here so that month name, the variable, will be used. If we now run it, we should see the month is unknown. Okay, so Now, this is obviously duplicate code now, but I just wanted to show you the two in comparison to each other so that you see how similar they are, and the logic behind them is pretty much the same. So they work in a very similar fashion, but they have certain advantages and disadvantages, and that's something I want to cover in the next video. So see you there. Welcome back. In this video, I want to quickly go over when to use switch and when to use if statements in C#. So here are a few scenarios where switch statements are more appropriate, and one of them is multiple distinct options. So when you have a variable that can take on several distinct values, a switch statement can provide a more concise and readable way to handle each case, which, for example, are months, right? There are only 12 months and they are super distinct options and very easy to follow along, yet it's very nice to have them in order using a switch statement. Then there are enum types. We haven't covered enum types yet, but they are very similar. Basically, months are stored as enums, so as the enum type inside of the .NET framework. Okay, we're going to cover that later on. We're going to look at enum types, and then you will see how switch statements will even make more sense. And then it's for improved code readability. So for cases where you have many possibilities, so many possible conditions, a switch statement just makes it look a little nicer. Switch statements are a little limited in a way in C# because they work best with integers, enumerates, and strings, and also with patterns, which is something we'll cover later on. But it does not support ranges or complex conditions, which is where if statements are super useful. Also, you get a slightly better performance using switch statements when there are many branches. However, nowadays it doesn't make that much of a difference because compilers have become really good at translating them accordingly and compiling it. So here are a few scenarios where if statements are more appropriate when you have complex conditions. So for example, conditions which have multiple different things that have to be true, multiple conditions that have to be true. So for example, the age has to be above 18 and the parent has to be with you, as we had this earlier example. Then an if statement is the better choice or the only choice. Then you have ranged values when you want to say, for example, if the age is between 13 and 18, then do X. And in that case, if statements are also significantly better. You can do ranges with switch statements, but they are not really nice. So it doesn't really make sense to do it. And then when you have dynamic conditions. So for example, if the condition can change during runtime, for example, the user enters something or data is getting loaded from the internet that is unpredictable. So in those cases, an if statement is also the better choice. Now you saw both variants. In the end, you can use if statements for everything, switch statements not for everything. So if you're unsure, use an if statement. Whenever you have very specific numbers that you want to handle or strings that you want to handle, then a switch statement would be the better way to go. All right, so that's it for this video. See you in the next one. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to set up a quiz application, and maybe we will need more than just one video, but I still wanted to build a little quiz app with you. So let's go ahead and create a new project, and it's going to be a console app again. I'm going to call this one quiz app, and then let's click next and keep the defaults here. And the quiz app will be quite simple. So we are going to need the following. We will need the questions. We'll need the answers, and then we will need to ask the user for question number one. Then the user can enter something, and we will check if the entered value is correct or the same as we have set up as the answer. If that's the case, the user gets a score by an additional point. So the score goes up by 1. And that means that we're going to need a variable that will store the score as well. And then at the end, we want to display to the user how many points or what the score was that the user got. So let's go ahead and start with a few questions. So for example, string Question 1 would be, what is the capital of Germany? As I live in Germany, I'm going to say the answer is going to be Berlin, even though the best city is Cologne, because I live in Cologne. So then we have a second question, and that would be, what is 2 plus 2? Super simple example, but it's really just about the logic behind the code, not so much about the difficulty of the questions. So I'm going to use answer being a string as well to keep it simple. And then question number 3 will be, what color do you get by mixing blue and yellow? And I would say that's green. So string answer 3 will be green. All right. So these will be our questions. Then we will need an integer that holds the score. Then we will need to ask the user the first question. So question number 1. And then we need to know what the user answer was. And answer will be console.readline. And here we check if the answer 1, or let's say the user answer 1, is equal to answer 1. If that's the case, then we're going to write on the console not the question, but actually we're going to write something like correct. And what do we need to do as well? If the user has answered correctly, we need to set the score up. So we will need to set the score to 1, or we can say score equals score plus 1. I will show you a faster way of writing score equals score plus 1 in the next video, but first let's keep it simple for this example. Then we need to have an else block here as well, because if the answer is not the same, then the user was wrong. So we're going to write on the console something like wrong, the correct answer is, and then because it's really simple here, I'm just going to use concatenation. I'm going to say answer 1 is going to be the right answer. Okay. So let's run this and test this before we keep going with our code, because that's really good practice in general to first test one thing before keep going with the rest. So I'm going to say Berlin and my program closes obviously. So we need to add console.readKey to keep our software running. So Moichido, there we are. What is the capital of Germany? Berlin. And it says correct. Perfect. So now let's run it again and say Berlin, and it says wrong, the correct answer is Berlin. So it really matters if we're using the capital letter or not. This is something we can fix. I'm going to show you how we can get our way around it in the next video as well, maybe the video after the next video. So now that you know how it works for the first answer, how does it work for the second answer? Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to copy this entire code, paste it in here, and now it's going to be question 2, and we're going to get answer 2 of the user, and we're going to do all the same, as well as here we place this with answer 2. And now we run it once again here for 3. So we replace question 1 with question 3, user answer 1 with user answer 3, as well as here, here, and finally here. So this will give us 3 questions with a potential score of 3. So how would we now use this to let the user know what their score was? So I'm going to say something like $quiz completed, and your final score is, here we're going to say curly brackets, score, so whatever the user had, out of 3. Okay, so in this case we do only have 3 variants, so 3 questions. Now you could obviously go ahead and say we don't have the tools yet. So right now it's all hard coded. We will find better solutions later on when we are working with arrays and for statements and all of the good stuff. We can make this better then, but for now this will be good enough. And now how do we go about telling the user that they were right with all questions, so that they got everything right? Okay, I hope you paused the video and tried it. You can pause it now still if you want to try it. So basically we're going to check if the score is equal to 3, Because if that's the case, then we know that the user got all right. So we're going to say, excellent, you got all the answers right. And then in the case that the score is greater than 0, they at least have something right. We're going to say something like, good job, but keep learning. And then finally we have the else block, where the user has 0 points. So we're gonna say, try again and see if you can get some answers right next time. All right, and that would be our little program. Okay, so let's run it again and let's check it out. Berlin is the capital of Germany, so we're gonna set 4 as the answer of 2 plus 2, and you get green when you mix blue and yellow. And we are quiz completed. Your final score is 3 out of 3. Excellent. You got all the answers right. Woo! Now let's do it again, but this time we're gonna only have 1 correct. So Berlin, this one will be 5 and this one will be something. And it says wrong, the correct answer is green. And quiz completed. Your final score is 1 out of 3. Good job, but keep learning. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next one, I want to quickly show you how you can do this better. Okay, this score plus 1. And then after that, we're going to look at how we can make sure that we don't care about capital letters or lower letters or empty spaces at the end of a entry. Because for example, if I write empty space Berlin, the answer is still correct, right? But it will say wrong, the correct answer is Berlin, even though I wrote Berlin, but I had an empty space here. So that's something that is very tricky also when entering usernames or passwords, where, for example, you by accident have an empty space at the end or at the beginning. This would lead to a bunch of problems, but there is a very simple solution. So we're going to look at that as well. So see you in the next video. Welcome back. So I told you that I would show you how to use this in a shorter statement. I'm going to show you real quick. So instead of saying score equals score plus 1, you could have said score plus plus. But more on that in the next video. I think what we should focus on right now would be to make sure that it doesn't matter if we are entering something with an empty space at the beginning or at the end or not. So let's start with that before we go into lowercase and uppercase. So the user answer is this string that we get from the user entry, right? And in order to get rid of an empty space at the beginning or at the end, we can use this method called trim. So there is this trim which removes all leading and trailing white space characters from the current string, which means all empty spaces at the beginning as well as at the end of our string, of the user entry, so to speak. Okay, and then there is trim end and trim start as well. So these would be just trim end, the trailing ones. So at the end of the string would be taken away. So all of the white spaces or, well, empty spaces, so to speak. And trim start does that for the beginning, so for the start of the string. So I'm going to say I want that to happen for the beginning and the end. So I'm going to use trim here. Does that for the beginning, so for the start of the string. So I'm going to say I want that to happen for the beginning and the end. So I'm going to use trim here. So user answer 1.trim. So if we run this now, and let's say I have a few empty spaces and I enter Berlin now and a few empty spaces at the end, it's still going to say correct. Okay, so that's what this trim keyword does. Then if we want to make sure that we are also using upper and lowercase, or we are ignoring basically upper or lowercase, we can just set everything to lower. So there's this other method, the string method, which is called to lower. There is another one that is called to upper, to upper will do the opposite. So it makes every single character inside of a string a capitalized character. It's like you're toggling caps and you're typing everything in caps. So it's like angry caps kids basically. So that's what this to upper would do. And to lower basically just changes from Berlin uppercase to Berlin lowercase in that case. So we need to use the brackets again. So you see how to use methods. It's similar to what we did with int methods. So scored int.parse, for example, right? We could parse something by using int dot and then the method name. And in this case, we're using the string variable itself, dot, method name, brackets. By using the brackets, we're basically executing that method. And then we can apply another method on top of that as well. So here, another dot to lower. So what this will do, this statement here, it will trim the white spaces at the beginning and at the end. And at the same time, it will make the whole text lowercase. And now we need to do the same thing for the answer. So dot to lower as well here. And then we need to add the brackets here as well. So what this will do is it will not matter if we are entering Berlin. Let me show you again. Berlin with an empty space like this, or whether we're entering it exactly like it's written here. So that's what this trim to lower does. So now let's do the same thing for our other answers as well. So I'm just going to copy that, keep it simple. So here, and then I'm replacing answer 1 with answer 2 for all of those. And the same goes for this one here. So I'm replacing answer 1 with answer 3 in that case. So now it won't matter if we're using lowercase or uppercase, empty spaces, whatever. All is good. We just need to make sure that we enter the name correctly. So what color do you want to use? Let's say green like this, and you see we have everything correctly. Okay, so that's a little bit of something that you can apply towards strings. There are a lot more methods that strings offer to us. So if you go and say user answer dot, you see there are plenty more, okay? A lot of different methods. Some have these greater sign, lower signs to them, but that's a little something for later. Okay, so to them, but that's a little something for later. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this video. See you in the next one.